My parents accused me of deceit when my business became profitable and tried to take a share through court. Hey Reddit, I've been sitting here for a couple of hours, just staring at the screen, wondering if I should really hit post. You know that feeling where you want to share your story but you're scared it's like opening up your soul to a bunch of strangers? Well, I guess I'm gonna take the leap. Here it goes, my story. It's one of pain, survival, betrayal, and somehow finding a way through it all. I'm hoping someone out there might understand and, in doing so, help me start to piece together the broken parts of myself. I don't know if you've ever felt like you were out of place in your own home, but that was my reality from the start. My parents, Richard and Teresa, were the kind of people who probably shouldn't have had kids. Yet here I am, the one who ended up paying the price. As far back as I can remember, I felt like I didn't belong, like I was some kind of unwanted accident. My dad, Richard, wasn't just cold and distant. He was a tyrant. No, more than that, he was a monster in a business suit. He ruled our lives through fear and intimidation. My mom, Teresa, wasn't any better. She had a talent for manipulation that was almost impressive. She had this way of twisting every situation until it was somehow my fault. She was the queen of guilt trips, using her sweet voice to convince everyone else that she was a doting mother while making my life a nightmare. It felt like I had two sets of parents, the ones everyone else saw, and the real versions I had to live with day in and day out. On the outside, we looked like any regular middle-class family. We lived in a decent neighborhood, they had steady jobs, and we did all the things normal families were supposed to do. But behind closed doors, it was a battlefield. No matter what I did, it was never enough. My grades, my behavior, even just existing, it all felt like a constant disappointment to them. I remember one day, I must have been about 9, when I brought home a B+ on a math test. I was actually pretty proud of myself. I'd studied hard for that grade. But when my dad saw the paper, he didn't even bother to look at me. He just shook his head, muttering something about how I was destined to be a failure if I didn't shape up. That was my dad, never a word of encouragement, never a nod to the effort. Just constant disapproval. And my mom? She always found a way to twist the knife a little deeper. She'd say things like, "Your father works so hard for us, and you can't even manage good grades? You're just like your uncle, and look how he turned out." Her favorite comparison was to my uncle, the black sheep of the family, disowned for his drinking and gambling. That was her way of reminding me I was just as worthless as he was. But the emotional stuff was only part of it, the physical abuse was something else. My dad had this way of turning the tiniest thing into a reason to punish me. Maybe I didn't answer him quickly enough, or I got in his way, and he'd lose it. His temper was like a storm, unpredictable and violent. He'd throw things, punch holes in the walls, and too often he'd take it out on me. I'd go to school with bruises on my arms, my back, my legs, and the teachers would just look the other way. It was like they knew what was happening but didn't want to get involved. School was the only place I could take a real breath. Even though home was a nightmare, at least when I stepped through those school doors, I wasn't in immediate danger. Sure, I still carried anxiety with me everywhere, always tense and waiting for something to go wrong, but it wasn't the same as living with my father. There was no need to tiptoe or constantly worry about his next outburst. And despite everything I was dealing with, I found a small group of friends who made life feel tolerable. We weren't the cool kids, but we didn't care, we had each other, and that was all that mattered. My closest friend was Jake, the loudmouth with a sarcastic streak. He was the one who could make me laugh, even when my world was crashing down. Jake had his own problems at home, but he always kept them buried deep. Then there was Max, the quiet observer. He didn't talk a lot, but when he did, you listened because he had this knack for understanding people in a way that most just couldn't. And then there was Emma, the heart of our little group. She was smart, kind, and had this infectious optimism that kept the rest of us from falling apart completely. The four of us became inseparable. Almost every day, we were either at school together or over at Jake's house, which felt like a sanctuary. His parents were everything mine weren't. Kind, patient, and genuinely caring. They welcomed us without judgment, and for once, I got to see what a healthy family looked like. A family that loved each other instead of tearing each other to pieces. It was no wonder I spent so much time at Jake's house. It was the only place I ever felt safe. But as time went on, my situation at home got worse. By high school, my father's outbursts had reached a whole new level. He'd come home angry, always looking for something to complain about, and it never took him long to find a reason to lash out. Whether I was doing homework or just trying to be invisible, it didn't matter. If he was in a bad mood, I was the one who got hurt. My mother, the master of manipulation, never lifted a finger to stop him. Sometimes, she even joined in, saying things like, "Maybe this will finally teach you to be a good son." Her cruelty made me sick. I threw myself into school, clinging to my friends and any distraction I could find to escape the chaos at home. But the darkness followed me everywhere. No matter what I did, it felt like I was drowning in a sea of misery that I couldn't escape. I started pulling back from everything and everyone. My grades tanked, my friendships frayed, and I could barely recognize myself anymore. I was spiraling, but I didn't know how to reach out for help. In the end, I made the decision to drop out of school. It wasn't something I did on a whim. It had been a long time coming. It felt like the only way to stop pretending everything was okay. I couldn't live the lie any longer. I couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The constant abuse from my parents, the anxiety of trying to keep up with school, and the overwhelming feeling that I would never be good enough. It was all just too much. One day, I walked into school, went straight to the principal's office, and told them that I was done. I was dropping out. They looked shocked at first, but they didn't argue with me. They could see how checked out I already was, how much I had given up. In their eyes, I was a lost cause. Telling my friends was the hardest part. I still remember the expression on Emma's face when I told her. She looked like she was about to cry, but she managed to hold it together. Max just nodded, his usual quiet and understanding self. Jake, in typical fashion, made a joke about how he always knew I would be the first to drop out. I could see the worry behind his sarcasm, though. My parents, on the other hand, completely lost their minds. My father yelled for hours, calling me every name he could think of and saying I was a disgrace to the family. My mother was no better. She cried, played the victim, and told anyone who would listen that I was ungrateful and throwing my life away. At that point, I just didn't care anymore. I had reached my breaking point, and I couldn't keep going the way I had been. I didn't have any idea what I was going to do next. I had no plan, no direction, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The abuse and constant belittling were destroying me, and I needed to get out as fast as I could. That's when I decided to apply to a university. It seemed like a long shot, especially since I had dropped out of high school, but I thought it was worth a try. To my surprise, I was accepted. It wasn't an Ivy League school or anything prestigious, but it was a decent university, and that was all I needed. Getting accepted was my chance to escape. I packed my bags and left as soon as I could. My parents didn't try to stop me. In fact, I think they were relieved to be rid of me, just as much as I was desperate to get away from them. University was like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in my life, I was free from their constant criticism, free from the abuse, and free to be myself. It wasn't easy, though. The scars my parents left, both physical and emotional, didn't vanish just because I was in a new place. I carried that trauma with me everywhere I went. I made new friends at university, but I never let go of the ones I already had. Jake, Max, and Emma were still a part of my life, even if we couldn't see each other in person as often. We kept in touch, and every time I came home during breaks, we would meet up, talk about life, and make plans for the future. We had this ongoing joke about packing up one day, moving to some random city where no one knew us and starting fresh. It was our way of dreaming about a better future, a way to leave everything bad behind and start over somewhere new. It was a dream we used to talk about when things got tough, a fantasy that none of us ever thought would actually happen, until it did. In my third year of university, everything started to fall apart again. Out of nowhere, my father showed up at my university. He was furious, like always, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. He didn't just come to shout and threaten. He came to drag me back home. He made a scene in front of everyone, yelling at me to pack my bags and leave with him. He called me a failure, a disgrace, and warned me that if I didn't come back, I would be dead to him. That was it, the last straw. There was no way I was going back. I called Jake that night, and we talked until the early hours of the morning. He knew I was barely hanging on, and for the first time we weren't just joking about running away. We were dead serious. The next day I called Max and Emma. We were all on the same page. Within a week we had scraped together what little money we had, packed our bags, and made the decision to leave everything behind. We didn't know where we were going, but we knew we had to get out. In the dead of night, we left the only place we had ever known, driving until the sun came up. We ended up in a city none of us had ever set foot in before. We were terrified and had no idea what we were doing, but for the first time in my life, I felt a rush of freedom. We had no apartment lined up, no jobs, and not a single plan for what we would do next. We found a cheap, run-down apartment that was barely holding itself together. We lived off instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, rationing every penny, but it didn't matter because we were finally free. The first weeks were chaos. We spent every day pounding the pavement, searching for any job that would take us. We wandered the streets of this new city, both excited and scared out of our minds, trying to figure out what we were supposed to do next. It wasn't easy, but it was our chaos, our mess, and no one could take that away from us. My parents did not let go easily. They bombarded me with phone calls, desperate voicemails, and frantic emails, trying to reel me back in. My father's rage was palpable in every message, and my mother's manipulation was sharper than ever. But I knew that if I caved, if I went back to them, it would break me beyond repair. I cut off all contact. I changed my number, blocked them everywhere, and vanished from their world entirely. Now, I'm sitting in this tiny apartment with my friends, still unsure of what tomorrow will bring. We aren't successful and we aren't living some dream life. We are scraping by, but we are doing it our way. Every day is a fight, but at least it's our fight. For the first time, I'm in control of my own destiny. Hey Reddit, it's me again. It has been a long time since I shared my story. If you've been following along, you know that my friends and I escaped from a life that nearly crushed us. We took a risk, packed everything we owned, and left behind a world of pain to start over. Back then, I was just a scared, desperate kid with a single bag and a few crumpled dollars in my pocket. Now we're still fighting, still struggling, but we're free, and that's more than I ever thought I would have. I had only a bag of clothes, a few friends by my side, and a lot of uncertainty about the future. A lot has changed since then, and not everything turned out the way we expected. So here's what happened after we made that huge leap. After we moved to the new city, we were living pretty much day by day. The small apartment we had found was barely livable, with cracked walls, hardly any furniture, and a constant smell of mildew. We didn't care because it was our freedom. At least we were away from our old lives, our parents, and all the things that had made us feel trapped. Living off instant ramen and cheap beer, however, wasn't sustainable. Soon enough, the thrill of starting over was overshadowed by the reality that we were broke, and life wasn't going to hand us any miracles. That's when we met Leo. He was a whirlwind of charisma and energy. He wasn't much older than us, maybe in his mid-20s, but he carried himself like he had seen and done everything. Leo was the kind of guy who always had the best stories to tell at parties, the one who knew someone who could get you anything you needed without asking questions. At first, we didn't trust him. He seemed way too smooth, a little too slick for us to believe his intentions were pure. But when you're desperate, trust comes more easily than it should. Leo made his money in ways that weren't exactly legal, but they weren't entirely illegal either. He existed in that gray zone where hustlers seem to thrive. We met him through one of Jake's old acquaintances from high school. Jake had always been the kind of guy who knew people, and in this case, his connections seemed to pay off, at least at the beginning. One night, we were all sitting around in our dingy apartment, wondering how we were going to make rent for the next month. Out of nowhere, Jake said he knew a guy who might be able to help us out. He admitted that the guy was unconventional, but he also said that this person had made a lot of money and was looking for partners. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. The last thing I wanted was to get involved in something shady, but we were broke, barely getting by, and the jobs we had managed to find weren't covering our bills. Max was working part-time as a tech support guy, Emma was still waiting tables, and Jake and I were picking up random gigs wherever we could. None of us were earning more than a few $100s a month, and it simply wasn't enough. So we decided to meet Leo. From the first moment I saw him, I knew he was different. He was dressed sharply and had an air of confidence that made it seem like he had everything figured out. Leo was the kind of person who could convince you to buy sand in the middle of the desert. He just had that charm. He took us to a tiny coffee shop in the center of town, bought us drinks, and started talking about opportunities. He looked us all in the eyes and said, "So, you guys want to change your luck, right?" His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought I might just say no and walk out, but I didn't. Back then, we were barely surviving, and Leo seemed like someone who knew how to win. It felt like he was offering us a way out of the grind we were stuck in, and I was tired of being stuck. We were tired of being broke and feeling like everything was a dead end. Leo told us that he had some business opportunities that weren't exactly mainstream, but he swore up and down that they weren't dangerous either. He made it sound simple, like all we had to do was trust him and everything would start to fall into place. After we left that meeting, we spent hours debating what to do. Part of me knew we were walking into something risky, but at the same time, what other choice did we have? We were living off scraps, and the future looked bleak. So we said yes to Leo's offer, and that choice set everything else in motion. Leo asked if we wanted to make some real money, flashing a confident smile like he already knew our answer. He told us he had a way to make cash quickly, easily, and with no strings attached. By that point, we were ready to listen. Leo explained his plan, which he called the Bureau. The idea was simple. We would buy shares in small, struggling companies that nobody had ever heard of, then sell those shares to investors at rock-bottom prices. The catch was that these companies were barely staying afloat, most of them teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. However, we would spin the story, making it sound like these companies were undervalued gems on the brink of a turnaround. In short, it was a hustle. While it wasn't technically illegal, it was definitely unethical. We hesitated at first because none of us wanted to risk ending up in jail over a quick payday. Leo was incredibly convincing, though. He broke down the process step by step, explaining how easy it was, how we wouldn't get caught, and how we could make more money in a few months than we would earn in years of working minimum wage jobs. He even showed us numbers from his past successes, proving that he had pulled this off before and made a fortune. "I'm not saying you'll be millionaires," Leo said with a grin, "but you'll be a hell of a lot better off than you are right now." Jake was the first to agree to the plan, which wasn't a shock to any of us. He had always been the risk-taker in the group, and he had a natural ability to persuade others to go along with his ideas. Max, our tech expert, quickly saw how we could automate most of the process, making it easier and reducing the risk of getting caught. Emma was the most reluctant. She was always the voice of reason, the one who reminded us to consider the consequences. But even she knew we were running out of options. I had a bad feeling about the whole thing from the start, but the temptation was too strong. The thought of finally getting ahead, of not having to worry about rent or bills, was something I couldn't resist. So we went for it. We became the Bureau. The first few weeks were slow as we tried to figure out the best way to pitch the stocks, identify our target audience, and get people to trust us enough to invest. Leo taught us how to talk to potential buyers, how to make them believe in the future of these failing companies. Jake, with his natural charm, quickly became our top salesman. He had a way of convincing anyone to believe in anything, and soon he was closing deals left and right. Max set up our website and created a sleek, professional front that made us look like a legitimate investment firm. He even created fake documents and company profiles to make everything look legal and official. His skills with technology were almost frightening. Emma took care of the bookkeeping, tracking the money that came in and keeping everything in order. She didn't like what we were doing, but she kept us organized and made sure we didn't make any major mistakes. As for me, I acted as the middleman, coordinating everything and making sure everyone knew what needed to be done. I made sure we stayed ahead of any potential problems, and I kept Leo in the loop about our progress. Once we got the hang of it, the plan took off faster than I ever imagined. In the beginning, we struggled, but soon the money started pouring in. Investors believed the stories we told about these nearly bankrupt companies. We painted such convincing pictures of hidden potential that they handed over their money without hesitation. Emma kept her mouth shut about how she felt, even though it was clear she didn't agree with what we were doing. As for me, I found myself somewhere in the middle, helping out wherever I could while trying to ignore the fact that we were basically scamming people out of their money. Shockingly, it worked. People started buying, not a huge amount at first, but enough to keep us afloat. As word spread, more people came to us, eager to get in on what they thought were undervalued stocks. It was unbelievable how quickly things took off. Within a few months, we were pulling in thousands of dollars in profit, way more than any of us had expected. Felt like we had hit the jackpot. We finally had money, freedom, and, for the first time in our lives, we weren't just surviving, we were thriving. We even upgraded our apartment, moving into a nicer place with actual furniture and a kitchen that didn't look like it was on the verge of collapsing. However, with success came paranoia. The more money we made, the more we started to worry about getting caught. We were walking a very thin line, and we all knew it. Every time the phone rang, my heart would skip a beat, terrified it was the police or an angry investor who had figured us out. We had gotten in too deep, and there was no easy way out. Leo, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. He kept reassuring us that we were untouchable, that as long as we kept our cool, no one would catch on. Then we met Mike, one of our buyers. He was different from the others. Most of our clients didn't know much about investing. They just wanted to make a quick profit. But Mike was serious and experienced. He knew the world of stocks and started asking questions that we couldn't answer. He wanted to see financial reports, balance sheets, and proof that the companies we were selling shares in were legitimate. We tried to brush him off, but he wasn't buying it. He kept pressing for details, pushing harder each time we dodged his questions. Eventually, Mike threatened to report us if we didn't come clean. That was the moment we knew we had to shut everything down. The risk of getting caught had become too great. One wrong move and everything we had built would collapse around us. We made the decision to end it. The bureau was over. It wasn't easy, but we all agreed it was the right thing to do. We had made enough money to start fresh, and it wasn't worth risking our freedom just to make more. We shut down the website, wiped all our records, and vanished from the scene. For a while, it felt like we were living in constant fear, waiting for the consequences to catch up to us. But nothing happened. Mike never followed through on his threat, and no one came after us. It was over and we were in the clear. Now, we faced a different problem. What were we going to do with all the money we had made? That's when Jake came up with the idea to open a gaming club. It sounded crazy at first, but it wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. We had all grown up playing video games, and it was something we were passionate about. With the rise of esports and gaming culture, opening a gaming club seemed like the perfect way to turn our dirty money into something legitimate. It felt like a chance to create something we actually cared about, something that mattered. We pooled all our funds together and found an old building in the city. It was in terrible shape, but we saw potential. Over the next several months, we worked day and night to transform that place into the ultimate gaming hangout. We invested in top-of-the-line gaming PCs, consoles, and even managed to score a few classic arcade machines. We decorated the walls with neon lights and posters of our favorite games, creating the kind of place we would have loved to hang out in when we were younger. We called it the Nexus, and it quickly became a local hit. At first, we only had a handful of regulars, college students and neighborhood locals who wanted a spot to relax and play. But as word spread, more people began showing up. We hosted gaming tournaments, streamed esports events, and even formed our own small competitive team. The Nexus became the go-to spot for gamers in the city, and for the first time, we were making money the right way. Everything seemed to be falling into place. We had a thriving business, a community of gamers, and a sense of pride in what we were building. But then, out of nowhere, life threw us a curveball. One night, as we were closing up the club, a man walked in. He was in his 40s, dressed in a sharp suit that looked completely out of place in our neon-lit gaming haven. He introduced himself as Detective Harris, and the moment I heard that, my stomach dropped. I was certain that the past had finally caught up with us, that the bureau had come back to haunt us. Instead, Detective Harris pulled out a photograph of Leo. "Have you seen this man?" he asked. I froze, staring at the picture of Leo, the man who had vanished months ago without a trace. One day he had been helping us set up the Nexus, and the next he was gone. His phone had been disconnected, and his apartment was completely empty. We had no clue where he had gone or why he had disappeared. Detective Harris explained that Leo was tied up in something far bigger than we had ever imagined, something that had drawn the attention of law enforcement. I told the detective the truth. We hadn't seen or heard from Leo since the day he vanished. Harris didn't look convinced, but he didn't push any further. He handed me his business card and told us to contact him if we learned anything. After he left, we sat in silence, stunned by what had just happened. We had always known Leo had a shady side, but none of us had imagined he was tangled up in something serious enough to draw the attention of the police. That night, we made a pact. There would be no more shady deals, no more risks. We were going to keep the Nexus clean and legitimate no matter what. We had come too far to lose everything over a careless mistake. Since then, things have been good. We've expanded the Nexus, opened a second location, and are even considering branching out into other ventures. We've talked about opening a cafe or starting a tech repair shop. We are finally building something real, something we can be proud of, and we're not looking back. For the first time in a long while, it feels like we are finally on the right path. Still, I can't help but think about Leo from time to time. Where is he now? Is he hiding somewhere, constantly on the run? Or did he get caught? Maybe he is out there, living a brand new life just like we are. I suppose we will never know. Right now, our focus is on the future, building something that will last. We have come a long way since the days of the Bureau, and while I do not regret what we did to get here, I know we were incredibly lucky to get out when we did. Hey Reddit, it has been a while since I last updated you, and things have become intense. If you have been following my story, you know that I left a toxic life behind, moved to a new city with my friends, and helped create a successful gaming club called the Nexus. Life was good, really good, for the first time in years. Just when I thought I had left my past behind, it came crashing back in a way I never expected. This is the story of how my parents tried to take me down and nearly destroyed everything I worked for. Spoiler alert, they failed. It had been almost 4 years since I last saw my parents, Richard and Teresa. Honestly, I had hoped I would never see them again. After everything they put me through, the constant abuse, manipulation, and outright hatred, I thought they were out of my life for good. Toxic people, however, always find a way to worm their way back, especially when they see you doing better without them. A few months ago, I began getting strange phone calls. The calls came from blocked numbers, with long stretches of silence before hanging up. It was annoying, but at the time, I dismissed it as prank calls or telemarketers who were not interested in leaving a message. Then, the letters started arriving, and that is when I began to sense that something darker was happening. The first letter was a simple and signed note that said, "You can't run from your past forever." It was cryptic, but I ignored it. I had a business to run, and I was not going to let some anonymous message mess with my life. Soon, though, the letters became more personal. They mentioned my parents, the abuse I had endured, and even referenced my friends, Jake, Max, and Emma. That was when I started to worry. Whoever was behind the letters knew way too much about me. The day my parents showed up at the Nexus is a day I will never forget. Jake was managing the front desk while I was in the back office, going over financial reports. I heard the door chime as someone entered, but I did not think much of it. People came and went all the time. Suddenly, Jake burst into the office, his face pale with shock. "They are here," he said, his voice barely audible. I frowned, not understanding what he meant. "Who is here?" I asked, but he did not need to answer. The moment I stepped out into the main room, I saw them. Richard and Teresa were standing there, looking as cold and intimidating as ever. They seemed out of place, staring at the neon lights and the gaming posters that covered the walls. In that instant, every emotion I had buried over the years came rushing back. The anger, the fear, and the resentment. They had found me, and I had no idea what they wanted. They stood in the middle of my club, looking completely out of place. It was like seeing ghosts, and my heart sank. For a moment, I felt like I was that scared child again, waiting for the next verbal attack or physical blow. I reminded myself that I was not that kid anymore. I took a deep breath and walked over to them. They looked older. Richard's hair was streaked with gray, and Teresa had more wrinkles than I remembered, but their expressions were unchanged. My father still had that hard, cold stare, and my mother's face was fixed in her usual mask of fake pleasantry. "What are you doing here?" I asked, not bothering to hide the anger in my voice. My father smirked, tilting his head with a look of condescension. "Well, we heard about your success," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "Seems like our little failure actually managed to make something of himself." I fought back the urge to yell and simply asked, "What do you want?" Teresa stepped forward, her voice sweet with insincerity. "We thought, since we're your parents and we did so much to raise you, it would only be fair if we got involved in your business. A partnership of sorts," she said. I could not believe what I was hearing. After everything they had done to me, after everything I had gone through, they had the nerve to show up and act like I owed them something. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a laugh born out of disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me," I said. My father's face grew stern, his eyes narrowing with frustration. "We are not joking," he replied. "You have built something impressive, but you could use help from people with experience. We can help you expand. Make this bigger than you ever imagined." My hands clenched into fists at my sides as I shook my head. "No, absolutely not. You do not get to walk in here and act like you are entitled to anything. You were never there for me. You spent my whole life tearing me down, and now you think I am going to let you waltz into my business? Get out." Teresa's smile wavered, and she tried one last time. "We are your parents. Blood is thicker than water. Don't make this harder than it has to be." My stomach twisted at the sound of her voice, at the way she twisted reality to play the victim. But I was not broken anymore. I had built this business with my own hands alongside my friends, and I was not about to let them destroy it. I stepped closer, meeting their cold stares with a glare of my own. "You made it clear a long time ago that you don't care about me. You only care about yourselves. Now leave, or I will have you thrown out." They did not argue. My father's eyes narrowed, and I could see his anger simmering just below the surface. But they turned and walked away without another word. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer. My parents were taking me to court. They were demanding a share of my business. They were demanding a share of the Nexus, claiming they were entitled to part of the business. They argued that they had supported me financially and that I owed them compensation for all the years they had spent raising me. I was furious. The idea that my parents, who had done nothing but abuse and manipulate me, were now trying to take away the one thing I had built on my own filled me with rage. They had never supported me. They were the reason I had left in the first place. Now, they were trying to force their way back into my life for money. I hired a lawyer named Jessica, a tough-as-nails woman Emma had recommended. Jessica did not take nonsense from anyone, and as soon as I explained the situation, she was all in. "We are going to fight this," she said, her voice full of determination. "They do not have a leg to stand on, but we need to be prepared. People like your parents do not back down easily." The next few weeks were a nightmare. My parents' lawyer, an arrogant and overconfident man named Robert, was relentless. They requested all kinds of financial records, business documents, and personal information, hoping to find anything they could use against me. It was clear that their strategy was to overwhelm us, to make us feel like we were drowning in a sea of legal paperwork. Jessica, however, was a fighter. She tore apart their arguments one by one, pointing out that I had been financially independent for years and that my parents had never contributed a single cent to my business. Their claims, she argued, were completely baseless. Despite her efforts, the stress was getting to me. My friends were worried, especially Emma. She kept telling me to take breaks and step away from the chaos for a while, but I could not do that. This was my livelihood, and the thought of my parents winning made my blood boil. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. Walking into that courtroom was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. I had never been involved in a legal battle before, and seeing my parents sitting there, calm and composed, made my stomach twist in knots. But I knew I could not back down this time. The trial was brutal. My parents' lawyer painted them as the victims, portraying them as loving parents who had sacrificed so much for their ungrateful child. They spun a whole story about how they had supported me emotionally and financially, how they had always believed in me, and how I had selfishly cut them out of my life once I became successful. It was almost impossible to sit there and listen to them lie through their teeth. When it was my turn to testify, I did not hold back. I told the court everything. I spoke about the years of abuse, the manipulation, and the emotional and physical scars they had left me with. I laid out every painful memory, not just to defend myself but to show the truth. Reliving those experiences in front of strangers and in front of my parents was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but I knew it was necessary. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but I needed the truth to come out. I wanted everyone to understand who my parents truly were. When the trial ended, I felt as though a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had done everything I could, and now all I could do was wait for the judge's decision. A week later, the verdict arrived. The judge ruled in my favor. My parents had no right to my business, no claim to the money I had earned, and they were ordered to cover all the legal costs. It was a victory, but it did not feel satisfying. I had never wanted to go to court in the first place. I just wanted them to leave me alone. But they could not accept that. The day after the court ruling, I walked into the Nexus and felt like the world had been pulled out from under me. The front windows were shattered, the neon signs we had installed were broken, and the interior looked like a battlefield. The gaming stations were smashed, monitors were destroyed, and the arcade machines were overturned. The entire place was a mess, as if someone had taken a bat to everything we had worked so hard to create. My heart sank as I stood there, staring at the destruction. Jake and Max were with me, and I saw the same shock and disbelief on their faces. "Who would do something like this?" Max asked, running his hand through his hair as he looked around at the damage. I knew exactly who it was, even though I had no proof. My parents had lost in court, and this was their way of getting revenge. They could not beat me legally, so they wanted to ruin me in any way they could. We called the police, who arrived quickly. They took photos, wrote down details, and filed a report, but I could tell they were not confident about solving the case. Vandalism like this is hard to trace when there are no clear leads. I was not willing to let it go. I wanted answers, and I needed them fast. That is when I decided to hire a private detective. The detective's name was Markson. He did not fit the stereotype of a movie detective. He wore a well-fitted suit, had a calm demeanor, and looked like a regular professional in his late 40s. He had a solid reputation for finding answers, and that was exactly what I needed. I told him everything about my parents, the court case, and the vandalism at the club. He listened carefully, writing down notes without interrupting. When I finished explaining, he nodded and said, "I will investigate. I cannot promise any results, but I will do my best to find the truth. People like your parents often make mistakes." Markson started his investigation right away. He gathered surveillance footage from local businesses, interviewed people in the area, and followed up on every possible lead. It did not take him long to start finding connections and putting the pieces together. The truth was beginning to emerge. The breakthrough came when Markson found security footage from a gas station down the street from the Nexus. It was late at night, just hours before the vandalism occurred. Richard's car was clearly visible on the tape, pulling into the station. He got out, filled the gas tank, and then drove off in the direction of the Nexus. It was not absolute proof, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions that my parents were involved. Markson did not stop there and continued his investigation until he found the evidence we needed. A witness who lived in the apartment building across from the Nexus had seen two people outside the club late that night. Although the witness could not identify them, they remembered hearing one of them shout, "He will regret this." It was not much, but it was enough to link my parents to the crime. With Markson's help, we collected everything: the surveillance footage, the witness testimony, and the timing of the events, and prepared to take my parents to court once more. This time, I was not just defending myself. I was going on the offensive. I did not think I had the strength to face another court case so soon after the first, But there I was, sitting in the same courtroom, staring at my parents across the aisle. They looked more anxious this time, aware that the evidence was not in their favor and that no amount of lies or manipulation could help them now. Their lawyer attempted to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial, but Markson's investigation was solid. Between the security footage, the witness testimony, and their clear motive, it was obvious that my parents were responsible for the vandalism. They were desperate to destroy what I had built and had chosen criminal behavior to do it. The trial lasted a week, and by the end, the outcome was clear. The judge ruled in my favor once again. My parents were found guilty of vandalizing the Nexus and were ordered to pay for the damages, covering the cost of repairs and then some. It was not a huge amount, but it sent a strong message. They could no longer control or intimidate me. It has been a month since that second court ruling, and life has finally started to calm down. The Nexus is back in business, stronger than ever. We used the compensation money to not only repair the damage but also to upgrade our equipment, and business has been booming ever since. I have not heard from my parents since the trial, and honestly, I hope I never do again. They are officially out of my life, both legally and emotionally. I have come to accept that they will never change. My friends, Jake, Max, and Emma, have been my foundation throughout this ordeal. Without them, I do not think I could have made it through these past few months. Together, we have built something truly amazing, and no one, not even my parents, can take that away from us. So that's where I am now, Reddit. I went from a terrified kid who escaped a life of abuse to a business owner who stood his ground and fought back. It has been a brutal journey, filled with battles I never thought I would have to face, but I came out on the other side stronger. I don't know what the future has in store for me, but for the first time, I'm not afraid to face it. I have taken back control of my life, and no one will ever take that from me again.